Welcome to Designed Company episode 31, and we just riffed up a title that is Make Capitalism Great Again. And today we have a very special guest, Daria, who is helping on designing UX design for both Fresh Mind and Designed Company. And so far it's going fantastically well. So Daria, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And Daria is also going to be with us for a foreseeable future, help and share with us her direct insights, which she's got like loads of from business world. So capitalism, purpose of capitalism. Who wants to tell me what perhaps is the case with capitalism right now and how its purpose is being served through the world, or whether it needs to change purpose? What comes to the mind when we say, like, what's the purpose of capitalism? Mo?
Well, I think if you're going to look at that, you have to start with the historical context of capitalism, right? And who better to study this than the Brits, who are pretty much the inventors and all-around masters of capitalism in a good way. And if you look at it, right, it came from the Protestant ethic in 18th, 19th century during Industrial Revolution. So, you had this Protestant ethic saying, you know what, it's cool to have money, but it's not really cool to spend it. So naturally, the people that were generating funds are reinvesting those, making more money. So I think capitalism just kind of became a way to basically, deliver mass goods and services and just really like serve a consumerist society. And that worked pretty well. I mean, we saw urbanization, we saw increase in standard of living. And then we got to kind of the 20th century, where we suddenly discovered this concept that the world is not an unlimited resource, at least in the material sense. And so, capitalism had to ask itself a question of reinventing itself. So if you ask me about the past purpose of capitalism, it's make as much money as you can. And if you ask me about the future purpose of capitalism, I think that's kind of where we can look at various ways to actually go around implementing that. It would be the good use of funds to pursue a higher purpose that is not just linked to money, but is also really linked to societal impact. And I'm not saying that in the sense of like all these companies are like, oh, we're like a ESG business that's just here to like help people, etc. I mean, if you're making really good food, that's a form of purposeful capitalism for me, right? But just getting out this money veneration and understanding that all these assets serve the attainment of a higher purpose would be my initial assessment of the matter.
Interesting. I'm just going to read the definition, actually a dictionary definition here. It says a capitalism, and I use this all the time, by the way, because I don't necessarily even know what I know. So I go back to definitions quite often. So it says an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So this private owners for profit is really where the designed company piece comes in, because that private owners of what? Companies. That's how I'm understanding that. And that's where a purposeful company, as far as I'm also interpreting that, comes into play, and purposefully designed company. Daria, what's your take on this?
I actually was like recently reading the book. It's called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And it's from the same guy who wrote the, what was the name? Homo sapiens. Yeah.
So Yuval Harari. Is it Yuval Harari?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was arguing that capitalism, if you look at this historically, like comparing to other things like communism and socialism and stuff like that, is the only foreseeable strategy for the world for now. Mm-hmm. But now, as more countries become capitalism countries, then now it doesn't really see any other way we can improve that. So we kind of like in our 21st century, we're kind of stuck with this idea of capitalism, and there's no like nothing else to look for in terms of economic development or other strategies, and we need to come up with something else.
Okay, so I think that covers the purpose quite nicely. So evolving it into then people, I'm just going to drive this conversation forward. Uh, from what I can see is that when certainly has been the case, because I originally came to UK as a refugee from ex-Yugoslavia, which was more of a socialist regime. And one of the things I first saw in my life in UK was homeless people. And I never really even understood what that was about. And certainly in the US right now, there is a massive upsurge of more homelessness and so on. And certainly this concept that something like 100 top earning capitalists in USA are earning something like 50%, 50% of the overall economic output. So there's a huge discrepancy between people's earning power and so on. So, and Mo, I think we touched on this before in terms of how designed company model brings this to a much more equitable level. But what's the kind of first thing that comes to mind when it comes to when we mention people in context of perhaps evolving capitalism, Mo?
Well, there's a interesting concept which I discovered only yesterday called the Great Reset, which is one of the big topics in World Economic Forum. It's also one of the big topics for all the conspiracy theorists, which gives me a good laugh. But
Yeah,
essentially, but essentially, one of the things that I quite enjoyed was that they themselves were saying it's about moving from from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, right? And so if you look at like the way any company's been managed up until now, there's this economic concept of negative externalities, right? Which is basically, let's say you're at a factory, the pollution is the problem of others, it's not yours. If you're running a bank, okay, your big bonus is yours, but then if the bank fails, there's a socialization of the losses, right? And so I think understanding that we're fitting into an ecosystem, we have a responsibility towards others, but also that we're kind of moving away from top-down system and more towards kind of matriarchal management where, you know, everybody has a role to play, plugging in, plugging out. It's really kind of moving humans and elevating them beyond just consumers and also positioning them as actors of the ecosystem they are within, whether that's work, whether that's home, etc. Which, by the way, is the whole reason I built Anya, right? Which is making people actually actors of influencing their environment. So this is the key thing I think we're going to see, which is it's not just about the money, the shares that you have in the company. It's about this on an atomic level, understanding there's humans, and even if someone kind of legally does not have the same necessary influence or power that you have, they're still extremely valuable in co-creating this future. And so I think that's what it is ultimately. It's moving from a situation where very small number of people dictate the future and everyone else is just cogs executing that, to one where, you know, there's still a small number of people maybe setting the vision of the future, because visionaries are still quite rare, but then what those details look like are delivered much less in command control format and much more in a co-creative format.
Daria, what comes to mind when you hear people in context of capitalism?
I think people in context of capitalism, it's becoming not very important at all, because it's like more about like, for example, Google and Amazon, they like their capitalization is insane. This money doesn't exist, so it's an insane number. And on the other hand, like especially in America, we have all these like healthcare systems, and in UK as well, we know how NHS works. And yeah, so I think we, with COVID pandemic now, we starting to explore the idea of universal income with like furlough scheme, and actually America giving money to their like population, so that might work. And I think we have enough money for that as well. So yeah.
Okay, so let's then talk about the system of, let's say, evolved capitalism or this post reset era, how that might work. I'm going to just riff up and say that I think there is an element of, as we already said, if people get more involved in having a say of what should and shouldn't be done and how it should be done, first of all, you get better systems through that. Although there is general kind of, I've heard, I think even Yuval Hariri was saying that like groupthink doesn't work and so on. Having said that, it's not necessarily about having everyone's opinion baked into design. It's about being aware of what people think and then designers churning through those sentiments, let's say, and designing the best solutions for general sentiment. I think that's what's really lacking in capitalism. It hasn't really evolved to be able to respond properly to that. And we hear a lot of people talk about, well, the market is a perfect weighing machine, blah, blah, blah. But we also know that as we discuss money more down the stream, that really market is overblown and really fake representation of what is in reality. And you only need to see that, you know, the markets are blowing up, the share prices are going up, but people really are struggling on the ground. So there's a major disconnect between people and the system of weighing what's valuable. Mo, what do you think?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, first of all, interesting area. But really, there's kind of two aspects, right? So, actually, what Dario said about UBI, I think we come back to that in money. But it also raises this idea that we often think of capitalism just in the sense of companies and the people that work within them. But we often tend to discount the people that might not be in work or that are not in these companies, right? And so I think, first of all, on a systematic level, it's putting in place the systems that enable work to be a choice and not an obligation, right? So when I see that in 2020, in a period of automation, that we're still measuring our progress as a society in terms of unemployment rate, that doesn't make sense. I mean, if we're actually going to go down this path of automation, actually we should be seeking to have an unemployment rate that is as high as possible, right? Because otherwise, what you get into is sort of like a entertaining for any plutocrat Hunger Games situation where it's like, here's a job, now dance for me, and maybe you can feed your children, right? That's so that's obviously not sustainable. It's just not sustainable, and that's going to lead to mass civil unrest. So first of all, there's just a duty to stop with all this rhetoric. Everyone's in it for themselves, and to understand we're a society. We have a duty to take care of others. Secondly, on more of a kind of a micro level on the systems, sorry to say, Anya is going to be part of your system for the future for building this matriarchal management. But more specifically, in terms of the systematic things, it's understanding that. So I'm going to give you a French example, right? In France, there's a big problem, which is that in companies, if you're too good at your job, it's a very, very recurrent thing for people to say, hey, man, or lady, would you mind being a bit less good? Because, you're kind of showing me up here to not be as competent as I should be. And this is a huge problem in France. Now, the beauty of this is that in the future, these kind of like mediocre situations aren't going to be possible. And so what I'm really excited about at the company level is going to be evolutionary nature of companies, and not in kind of like a Hunger Games, you're all fighting to like look good sense, but just in the sense that people that genuinely want to be here, that genuinely want to do stuff, are going to be elevated, are going to be listened to, are going to be considered. And people that are just here to kind of like, whatever, they're naturally going to be automated, and that's fine. But again, right? So actually, that's one thing we're pursuing, which we'll talk about later, which is kind of the fractal systematization automation, and understanding that ultimately our job, whatever your job is to continuously eliminate as much of our current job as we can, or at least systematize it, and always be moving to higher order work. And so really for me, that's the new capitalism. It's one that doesn't see humans as computers, but sees, not in that way, but more sees humans as actual humans, and gives an opportunity through their work to spiritually, mentally elevate themselves and progress and develop themselves.
Okay, so let's move on to innovation, conscious of time. And Daria, I'm going to ask you a question about innovation. But for me, in terms of innovation in capitalist world, innovation seems to stifle. It's like kind of not really going anywhere. There's few companies that seem to be innovating, certainly in a little bit more, let's say, radical way. But majority is just kind of incremental thing that happens every like quarter or half a year or yearly cycles. Daria, what are you seeing in terms of innovating capitalism? What's the kind of core one, perhaps, innovation that you could see as kind of value adding?
Oh, okay, but I generally like see that our generation is wants to be more involved, but then the question like how you're gonna implement. So if someone would really come up how people can be more involved, that would be massive innovation, because there is like, if you look at the existing systems, right? For example, like in Switzerland, where they have referendum for everything for the government, and it's take years and years and years to decide what they're going to implement and what not. And on the other hand, there's like investments, so people voting by investments, and we can still see a lot of people actually like invest in non-sustainable practices like fossil fuel and stuff like that. So it's very not perfect yet, and this needs to be changed, I think.
Yeah, so the good news is that Anya is playing into that space very much, where really even whether we're always in a company right here, where three of us are in a company talking about this podcast topic, and later on you might be in a company of your fiance or future wife or current wife and your children and so on. You're always in some sort of company, and people are always bringing up these kind of thoughts, and some thoughts you discount as just blabbing, which is cool. People, speak about all sorts of stuff. Some thoughts are really important. Of course, when you get married, you realize that your married partner, when they say do this, it's like really important. And some thoughts are not so important. They can wait until tomorrow or whatever. They might even just fizzle out over time. And so moving on to products, I think the product becomes increasingly more of an evolutionary, as we mentioned so far, evolutionary ecosystem that's constantly driving up towards greater prosperity of all. Now, often that's perhaps being written about, and I'm not the greatest student of Communist Manifesto or socialism and so on. Perhaps socialism pitches it that way, but I think it's ultimately capitalism, the working capitalism, that provides greater and greater prosperity, but doesn't cap it at any point in time. It's an ongoing, like nature around us is constantly producing more variety, and that's what we're really looking for. I think we're also looking for more variety of products that are sustainable products, that are good for us products. Mo, what do you think?
Well, I like this idea that both you and Daria have raised about, ideas that come in decision making, right? And Daria, you said the good example of Switzerland, Swiss referendums. I think there's a huge confusion that we just need to eliminate straight up. Expressing your opinion is not the same as making a decision. And as long as we make an amalgamation between those two, we're never going to move forward, because we're always going to be, number one, we're always going to be seeking consensus, which is slow. But number two, we're going to be ruling by majority. And the key thing is that many times the best decision is one that is not actually popular to the majority. And so what I'm a big proponent of is this word, which I came up with like 20 seconds ago, of decentralized autocracy, right? So what is decentralized autocracy? It's basically this idea that instead of concentrating all the power in one person's hands, and then having people just be executing parts of that power, it's more understanding that. So I mean, if you look at the sociological, sources of power, it's like, charisma, ability to wield violence, ability to wield resources, but really it's also just like mostly legitimacy, right? This is the kind of power you want. One which is like, you have this power because you are the most legitimate person to make use of this power, if you see what I mean, right? And so really, like, if we look inside organizations, I think what we want is something where basically people feel comfortable expressing their opinion. They also feel comfortable not expressing their opinion. People feel comfortable only soliciting the ones that are relevant. So, I mean, it's good to have different views, but maybe I just know that someone might not have anything to say, and that's cool. But most importantly, that those who are making a specific decision, whether it's how we're going to spend $50 million or which brand of tea are we going to have at the office, right? Across that whole spectrum, that they're comfortable making those decisions, and that people realize that decisions can be made and they can be changed. So for me, this is the biggest product in this new form of capitalism. It's kind of moving away from this feudal lord sort of thing, from the kind of le roi de droit divin, as we say in French, Louis XIV, you know, he was the king because his right to be the king came from God, which is kind of like, you know, what psychopathic CEO is today. And moving more towards something of legitimacy where power is exercised and given because people are the most legitimate to exercise that power.
Daria, any thoughts on that before I jump in and compliment those statements from Mo?
I think it's true, but yeah, it's a complicated question, because if you go into details, the question like how you would execute that.
Yeah, and so I think what it certainly has been the case with major big monarchies, even the monarchies that worked well, what they did is they took care of local areas well enough, and they supplied them and provided them with the goods and services that they needed, that they were lacking, and maybe exploited the goods and services that they had surplus of. And so that was usually done through some sort of messenger type services where there would be local, let's say, administrators who would be monitoring the opinions of local people and understand, oh gosh, the farmers are going to do an uprising here because their children are starving to death. Like, we can't have this, right? Because if enough of them kind of start rising up, they're going to bring the king down. So even in monarchies, a kind of ancient version of Anya would have been running, and when it was running, the monarchy ran well. Nobody really complained, because people, when they have their basic security, food, peace, bit of land that they need, all that kind of stuff, they're happy. They couldn't care less about what system they're living under. The problem is when the system starts cracking down, that then people rise up. And so with Anya, in the modern, technologically enabled and increasingly more connected world, we can have this happening to the most minute level, as Mo mentioned, what kind of coffee I'm drinking in my even home office, if necessary, and the company could provide me with better supply of coffee, for me to be happy and contribute back in terms of my thoughts, ideas, and innovationary, evolutionary contribution. So
I just want to quickly echo something there, Jason, that you mentioned. You said very important words. People had enough to eat in the olden times, and therefore they weren't really caring about the system they lived under. If you take a look at Designed Company, right, systems comes after people. So I think this is the big shift. People nowadays, they keep talking, oh, the system destroying my life. Really what we're going for here in terms of operational philosophy is people being over the system, people seeing the system not as something imposed upon them, but something that they have a role in building and something that they can evolve, and most importantly, something that they opt into. And so really, this is the key thing.
Yeah, the system should be serving the people. And then when it comes to money, I think Daria is here becoming a bit of an expert on UBI, at least through reading the book that she's reading right now, which actually sparked up this whole conversation. So Daria, what's your then take on money and distributing money? Let's say I'm Bill Gates, or I'm Apple, and I'm sitting on all this like $150 billion of surplus cash that I don't know what to do with. You know, how should I distribute that? How do I utilize that?
First of all, we all know that all this money, they're not literally sitting on them. It's just capitalization. So there's it's not free cash to spend. Mm-hmm. And I think it's like a bigger question for governments, not for individual companies. So it's more about the system the government implements. And there was like a couple of studies about, I think it was like one village in Canada, they tried it on, and the overall like satisfaction of life and stuff like that go like up significantly. And a lot of people, because the main idea of EBS is like people don't go for work just for money. They want to be useful. They want to feel useful, and they want to bring like something good back to the society. And when we still have people who are just going for any work just for money, like the whole system is corrupt. So we need to create this situation for the people where they can choose and do whatever they really good at, not just like sort stuff. I mean, some people are good in sorting stuff, but that's the thing.
I think there's also a huge thing here, right? In terms of freeing humans, if you look at how a lot of people are raised, it's with deference to authority and being like, you know, this is your feudal lord that's paying your salary, they're ensuring your sustenance, so you should like obey them without questioning them, right? And that's kind of unhealthy, really. That's not how I wish for humanity to live in 21st century. So I think like UBI is number one about freeing humanity and just making it that I don't have to take that second job to feed my family, you know, or maybe even the first, but just understanding that if we're in an age of abundance and automation, then, you know, there is no reason that everyone should not have a piece of that. And I love how actually the Americans present it, because they call it, what is it? It's like a universal dividend, something dividend, right? But they basically, the way it's framed there is every citizen should be getting a small piece of the action of all the economic activity going on in the country. And I quite like that. Why should the government be the only one getting a piece of the action?
Yeah, in some sense, as far as I'm concerned, the government ought to be devolved or dissolved into what's the phrase you used earlier on? Autocrat, what is it, like distributed
Decentralized autocracy.
decentralized autocracy. That basically is like empowering each individual as like being in their own good company as an individual, which is again Designed Company. We discovered this works for individuals too, because I have my own personal life purpose, who I am as a person, how I run my habits, how I innovate myself and do some different things. What do I produce? How much money do I need to live and prosper and so on? And how am I growing every day? So that runs as a fractal on individual level. And as it's distributed across in a connected economy, which we are living in, it's just connected in a way that some people are starving and some people got too much that they don't know what to do with. As we redistribute that, that universal basic income actually starts growing the entire ecosystem as opposed to choking it up. And so in terms of growth, what comes to mind here is that the growth areas that are certainly being spoken about even by the, you know, the Davos crew, let's call them, are growth areas of wellness, sustainability, circular design, basically creating products and services that are actually sustaining and supporting the civilization as opposed to disposables and so on. But it seems that through the pandemic, we've kind of gone more towards disposables, if with the masks and so on, and all these kind of things that are supposedly preventing the pandemic. But I think going forward, the growth will continue to be in the sustainable areas. What do you think, Daria, is the kind of in a great capitalist system growth opportunity?
In the great capitalist system,
as the one that works.
I mean, I think the big thing like humanity don't understand yet is like, if we keep going like that, we're gonna just destroy ourselves. It's not like we cannot live without our planet, so we need to start doing something about that. And the same, like, I think it's well known, but I'm not sure why like our government is not acting on it. It's like when you raise the average level of life for other people, it's like the whole economy is actually like growing with that, because people have more money to spend and you need to produce more stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's an obvious truth. I think a lot of people know that. So we just need to embrace it and implement into society.
Mo, what's your take on this?
I think it's a redefinition of what growth means, right? So yeah, I mean, GDP growth is good. I mean, as you have like increasing population, it would make sense to have GDP growth in the sense that we want, you know, to still have like some sort of equal wealth per capita still, or increasing each year as people collectively become wealthier. First of all, that might come through redistribution of existing wealth. So even though we might not see GDP grow, it doesn't have to go down. But if you better distribute it, fine. That's kind of the monetary pure growth aspect. But I think really we're entering an era, like if we can overcome this whole like, you know, survivalistic items that are still a reality today, then we're just going to go into a period where it's going to be freeing up people's minds to focus on, you know, personal, spiritual growth, you know, in whatever way people wish to achieve that, but really kind of moving to a next level of humanity on individual and collective level. So really kind of my dream for the future is to see, you know, Skynet running most of the world, and then basically having people like doing work they enjoy, and then spending more time like in parks and like with their families, or at the beach if you don't like parks and mountains. So whatever that is.
But that's actually an interesting thing about GDP. It's like the way they calculate GDP doesn't care whether you're happy or not. Because if you're like spending money on your healthcare and you're ill and not living your best life, it's still growing. It's like GDP is the worst thing you can use.
You know, if you destroy a forest and then have like a cleanup crew, you're back to square one, but you produce GDP. Someone explain, please.
It always reminds me of Lorax, the movie, which talks about that quite nicely, where the entire city has been destroyed, but it's going really well because the big oligarch is doing well. So just to summarize this topic, you know, this is actually a very cool conversation. So basically what we said is, as we plug into the individual purposes and the company purposes and connect that properly, we have got the opportunity to create people who are working on purposeful jobs that are being served by a system that's a lot better automated, continuously innovating and evolving in fractal way, creating products that are contributing towards well-being and are sustainable in cyclical fashion. Money becomes better distributed, and as a cash flow of the overall company, as a kind of society, as a company, designed company, works better. There is continuous growth across the board, and people can contribute as much as they want towards their personal growth that then contributes to the bigger growth of this fractal designed company across the whole globe. It seems to make very much sense to me, and Anya as a company is very much geared up towards this to deliver it in a continuous fashion that takes care of every single detail across this in a completely accounted for fashion in real time. So thank you very much, guys, for speaking about this, and it was so much fun. So see you next time.
Nice one. Looking forward.